The cruelest betrayals are never shouted across a room, they are whispered after you have already given someone everything. My name is Rachel Bennett, and if you had walked past our little blue house on Maple Street that spring, you would have believed we were the picture of an ordinary American family. Every morning before sunrise, I brewed fresh coffee, opened the kitchen curtains to let the golden light spill across the hardwood floor, and prepared breakfast before checking on my mother-in-law, Margaret. She had been fighting a serious illness for months, and every day began with medication, warm tea, and patient encouragement. My husband, Ethan, always kissed me on the forehead before leaving for work, thanking me for taking such wonderful care of his mother. I believed every word. I believed every smile. More than anything, I believed we were building a future together. A year earlier, I had walked away from a career I genuinely loved because Ethan looked into my eyes one quiet evening and said, "My mother needs us." He never demanded that I quit my job. He never ordered me to stay home. Instead, he spoke with tears in his eyes, telling me that family came before everything else. I admired that about him. I thought it revealed the kind of man he truly was. So I resigned from my position, packed away the clothes I once wore to the office, and devoted my days to caring for Margaret. The routine became my entire world. I learned every medication schedule by heart. I drove her to every doctor's appointment, sometimes spending hours in waiting rooms with magazines I never finished reading. I cooked meals that matched her dietary restrictions, helped her walk through the backyard when she was strong enough, and sat beside her on difficult nights when sleep refused to come. Margaret often apologized for becoming such a burden, but I always squeezed her hand and smiled. "You are family," I told her. "Family is never a burden." She would look at me with grateful eyes and whisper that she had always wanted a daughter. Those words filled a place inside my heart that I did not even know had been empty. Our neighbor, Grace Miller, often waved from across the fence while watering her flowers. She saw me helping Margaret into the car, carrying groceries, or simply sitting beside her on the front porch enjoying the evening breeze. More than once she told me, "Rachel, not everyone would do what you are doing." I always laughed softly and answered the same way. "I am only doing what family should do." Ethan seemed proud whenever someone complimented me. At neighborhood barbecues he smiled as friends praised my dedication, placing an arm around my shoulders as though we had accomplished everything together. Looking back now, I remember something else that I ignored. Every compliment directed toward me was answered by Ethan instead of me. Every sacrifice became part of his story instead of mine. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Love has a strange way of convincing us that small cracks in the foundation are only shadows cast by the sunlight. I had no idea those tiny cracks were quietly becoming the beginning of the day that would change my entire life forever. As the weeks passed, Margaret grew stronger in ways that felt almost miraculous. She no longer needed help walking from her bedroom to the kitchen. She laughed more often, spent afternoons reading on the porch, and even insisted on watering the flower beds herself for a few minutes each evening. Watching her recover filled me with quiet joy because every difficult day suddenly felt worthwhile. I believed we had made it through the worst together. Ethan seemed happier too, although something about him had begun to change in ways I could not quite explain. He stayed later at the office, answered more phone calls behind closed doors, and spent less time sitting beside his mother after dinner. Whenever I asked if everything was all right, he smiled quickly and said work had become unusually busy. I wanted to believe him. After everything we had survived, doubt felt almost disrespectful. One Saturday morning, I found the cardboard box that held my office awards while cleaning the hall closet. A thin layer of dust covered the lid. I sat on the floor for several minutes, running my fingers across my old employee badge and remembering the woman I used to be. Before I could think too deeply, Margaret called my name from the living room, asking if I would join her for tea. I closed the box without another word. Some dreams, I told myself, could wait a little longer. Grace stopped by later that afternoon with a homemade peach pie. She smiled warmly at Margaret before pulling me aside near the front porch. "You have done more than most daughters would have done," she said quietly. I thanked her, but I admitted that I sometimes wondered what life would look like after Margaret fully recovered. Grace studied my face for a moment before replying, "I hope someone is taking care of you too." Her words lingered in my mind long after she left. That evening, Ethan came home carrying takeout from my favorite Italian restaurant, something he had not done in months. We shared dinner together, laughed about an old vacation to Colorado, and for a brief moment everything felt normal again. Margaret smiled as she watched us from across the table, telling us that seeing us together was the best medicine she could have asked for. Ethan reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I smiled back, believing the hardest chapter of our lives had finally come to an end. Later that night, after Margaret had gone to bed, I overheard Ethan speaking softly on the phone in the backyard through the cracked kitchen window. I could not hear every word, only scattered sentences carried by the cool evening breeze. Then one sentence reached me with perfect clarity. "She has done everything I needed her to do." I stood completely still, convincing myself he must have been talking about a project at work, yet something deep inside me refused to believe that simple explanation. For the first time since I had left my career behind, an uneasy feeling settled into my heart, and although I desperately wanted to ignore it, I could not shake the sense that the life I trusted was quietly beginning to slip away. 2 days later, the air inside our home felt strangely different, as though every familiar room had become a place I no longer recognized. Margaret was feeling well enough to spend the afternoon with a friend from church, so for the first time in months the house was unusually quiet. I folded laundry, watered the herbs by the kitchen window, and caught myself smiling at the thought that perhaps life was finally returning to normal. Around 4 o'clock, I heard Ethan's car pull into the driveway. He walked inside carrying his leather briefcase, but instead of greeting me with his usual smile, he placed the case on the dining room table and stood silently with his hands in his pockets. His expression was unreadable. "Can we talk?" he asked. There was something in his voice that made my stomach tighten. I nodded and pulled out a chair, expecting him to tell me about work or perhaps suggest that we finally take the vacation we had postponed for over a year. Instead, he remained standing. After several long seconds, he looked directly at me with a calmness that felt colder than anger. "Rachel," he said, "my mother is doing well now." I smiled gently. "I know. It feels wonderful to see her getting stronger every day." He slowly shook his head. "You are missing my point." My heartbeat quickened. The silence stretched between us until he finally spoke the words that would divide my life into a before and an after. "I only needed you to care for my mother while she was sick." At first, I honestly believed I had misunderstood him. I waited for him to laugh, to explain that he had chosen the wrong words, but nothing came. His face remained completely still. "What are you talking about?" I whispered. He let out a slow breath and avoided my eyes for the first time. "This marriage has not been working for a long time. I stayed because I could not leave my mother without someone I trusted to care for her. Now she does not need that kind of help anymore." Every sentence landed with quiet precision, as though he had rehearsed them many times before saying them aloud. I felt the room spinning even though I had not moved an inch. I searched his face for the man who once told me that family meant everything, but I could not find him. "So that was all I was to you?" I asked softly. "Someone convenient?" He rubbed the bridge of his nose before answering. "I think it would be better if you packed your things and found somewhere else to stay." There was no shouting. No slammed doors. Just the unbearable stillness of a life collapsing without making a sound. I looked toward the hallway where photographs from happier years still hung on the wall. Every birthday, every holiday, every smiling memory suddenly felt like pages from someone else's story. I quietly walked upstairs, opened the bedroom closet, and reached for my suitcase. My hands trembled as I folded my clothes, but no tears came. Sometimes heartbreak is so deep that even sorrow stands silently beside it, unable to find the right words. By the time I carried my suitcase downstairs, the late afternoon sunlight had begun to fade across the living room floor. Every familiar object seemed frozen in place, as though the house itself refused to believe I was leaving. Ethan stood near the front door with his arms folded, avoiding my eyes. He did not ask if I needed help. He did not tell me to stay. He simply waited. Before I reached the door, I heard Margaret's voice from the hallway. "Rachel? Are you going somewhere?" She walked slowly into the room, leaning lightly against the banister, her face bright with the strength she had fought so hard to regain. The smile disappeared the moment she noticed the suitcase in my hand. "What is going on?" she asked. Ethan answered before I could speak. "Rachel thinks she needs some space for a while." His explanation sounded smooth, almost practiced. Margaret looked at me instead. We had spent countless mornings together over tea, and she knew my expressions better than anyone. "Rachel," she asked again, her voice softer this time. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to explain that the son she loved had just ended our marriage with a handful of carefully prepared sentences. But I looked at the joy that had finally returned to her face after months of illness, and I could not bring myself to replace it with fresh heartbreak. I forced a small smile and nodded. "I just need a little time to think." She reached for my hand immediately. "Then promise me you will come visit." I squeezed her fingers gently. "I promise." Those were the hardest words I had spoken all day because I did not know if I would ever be welcome in that house again. Grace happened to be trimming the rose bushes across the street as I rolled my suitcase toward my car. She frowned the moment she saw me. "Rachel, are you all right?" she called. Before I could answer, Ethan stepped onto the porch and simply watched without saying a word. Grace glanced from him to me, sensing that something was terribly wrong. I managed a quiet smile that convinced no one. "I will be okay," I said, placing my suitcase into the trunk. She walked closer and wrapped me in a warm embrace without asking another question. Sometimes kindness speaks louder than curiosity. As I drove away, I looked into the rearview mirror one last time. Margaret stood behind the living room window, lifting her hand in a gentle wave, believing I would return in a few days. Ethan remained on the porch, expressionless, watching my car disappear down Maple Street. Less than an hour later, I checked into a modest roadside hotel a few miles away. The room was clean, quiet, and unfamiliar. I placed my suitcase beside the bed and finally allowed myself to sit in complete silence. My phone remained untouched on the nightstand for several minutes before it suddenly began to ring. The name glowing across the screen was Margaret. I closed my eyes, took a slow breath, and realized that the truth I had tried so desperately to protect could not remain hidden forever. My hand hovered above the phone for several seconds before I finally answered. "Hello?" I tried to keep my voice steady, but Margaret immediately sensed something was wrong. "Rachel, sweetheart, where are you?" she asked gently. "Your room is almost empty, and Ethan keeps telling me you just needed a break. That does not sound like you." I closed my eyes, staring through the hotel window at the parking lot below where families loaded groceries into their cars, living ordinary lives that suddenly felt very far away from mine. "I am safe," I replied softly. "That is the most important thing." Margaret remained silent for a moment before speaking again. "Rachel, please tell me the truth." The kindness in her voice nearly broke the last piece of strength I had left. Before I could answer, I heard another voice in the background. It was Grace. She must have stopped by after seeing me leave the neighborhood. Margaret quietly asked her if she knew what had happened. There was another long pause, followed by muffled conversation that I could not fully hear. Then Grace spoke clearly enough for me to recognize every word. "Margaret, Rachel did not choose to leave." The line went completely silent. My heart pounded so loudly that I could barely hear myself breathe. A few moments later, Margaret returned to the phone. Her voice had changed. It carried confusion, disbelief, and quiet pain. "Rachel, did Ethan ask you to leave?" Tears finally rolled down my cheeks. I had tried so hard to protect her from this moment, but the truth had found its own way home. "Yes," I whispered. "After you started feeling better, he told me he only needed me while you were sick." Margaret gasped softly, as though the air had suddenly disappeared from the room. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she asked the question that mattered most. "Is that why you gave up your career?" I nodded before remembering she could not see me. Yes. I believed we were making that sacrifice together. Another long silence followed. Then I heard Margaret quietly crying for the first time since her illness began. "I never knew," she said through trembling breaths. "Rachel, if I had known what you were giving up, I would never have allowed it." I assured her that none of this was her fault, but she refused to accept that answer. She kept apologizing over and over, each apology sounding heavier than the last. Before ending the call, she said something I would never forget. "You loved me like a daughter loves her own mother. If my son has forgotten your worth, then he has forgotten the values I tried to teach him." We said goodbye, but I knew nothing inside that family would ever be the same again. Hundreds of miles of emotion now separated Ethan from the woman who had raised him, and for the first time since I had packed my suitcase, I realized that the truth had finally stepped into the room where no lie could survive. The following morning, I woke before sunrise even though there was nowhere I needed to be. Habit carried me out of bed at 6 o'clock, the same time I had always prepared Margaret's breakfast and organized her medication for the day. For a few quiet moments, I reached for a notebook that was no longer beside me, and then reality settled in once again. My phone remained silent until nearly 9 o'clock when a message from Grace appeared. "Margaret wants to see me this morning. I think she finally knows everything." I stared at the screen without replying. Part of me worried about what would happen inside that house, but another part knew the truth deserved its own voice. Later that afternoon, Grace called me. She sounded exhausted, yet determined. "Rachel," she said softly, "Margaret confronted Ethan." My heart skipped a beat. Grace explained that Margaret had asked her to come over because she wanted someone who would tell her the truth without protecting anyone's feelings. Sitting together in the living room where we had shared so many peaceful afternoons, Grace described every doctor's appointment, every sleepless night, every grocery trip, every meal I had prepared, and every opportunity one had quietly sacrificed. She told Margaret about the promotion I had declined because caring for family came first. She even mentioned the mornings she watched me help Margaret into the car before driving across town to another medical appointment. According to Grace, Margaret listened without interrupting, tears filling her eyes as each memory unfolded. When Ethan arrived home from work, he found his mother waiting in the living room. She asked him one simple question. "Is everything Grace told me true?" There was no anger in her voice, only disappointment. Ethan reportedly stood silent for several seconds before quietly admitting that he had ended our marriage. Margaret then asked the question he could not escape. "Did Rachel leave because she stopped loving this family, or because you decided you no longer needed her?" Grace told me the silence that followed answered everything before Ethan even spoke. He finally admitted that he believed it was time for both of us to move on. Margaret slowly stood from her chair and looked at the son she had raised. "You measured a human heart by its usefulness," she said. "That is not how I taught you to love people." Grace said Ethan tried to explain himself, insisting that their marriage had already been struggling, but Margaret gently raised her hand and stopped him. "A struggling marriage deserves honesty," she replied. "It does not deserve someone being used until they have nothing left to give." When Grace finished telling me the conversation, I remained quiet for a long time. I felt no satisfaction knowing Ethan had been confronted. There was only sadness that so much pain had become necessary before the truth could finally be seen. Yet somewhere beneath that sadness, a small sense of peace began to grow, because for the first time since I had walked away from our home, I realized I no longer needed to defend the life I had lived. The people who truly mattered had finally seen it with their own eyes. 3 days later, I checked out of the hotel and rented a small one-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. It was nothing like the house I had called home for years. The kitchen was barely large enough for a tiny table, the windows overlooked a quiet parking lot instead of a garden, and the walls were still empty because I had not decided which memories deserved to follow me into this new chapter. Yet when I unlocked the front door for the first time, I realized something unexpected. The silence inside that apartment felt different. It did not carry rejection. It carried possibility. I spent the next few days updating my resume, responding to old colleagues, and wondering whether anyone would remember the woman I had been before I put my career on hold. To my surprise, an email arrived from the company where I had once worked. My former manager, Susan, invited me to lunch. She welcomed me with the same warm smile I remembered and listened carefully as I explained that I was ready to return to work. She did not ask why my marriage had ended. She simply said, "Rachel, your talent never disappeared. We only wondered when you would come back." Those words reminded me that I had not lost myself forever. I had simply spent too long believing my value depended on what I could do for someone else. Meanwhile, Grace continued checking on Margaret almost every day. During one of our phone calls, she told me that the house had become strangely quiet. Margaret no longer sat with Ethan during dinner. Their conversations had grown short and painfully polite. She appreciated that he helped around the house, but something essential between mother and son had changed. Grace said Margaret often looked toward the empty chair where I used to drink tea with her every afternoon. One evening, my phone rang again. This time it was Margaret herself. Her voice sounded stronger than it had only a week earlier. "Rachel," she said gently, "I wanted you to know that I met with my attorney today." I was surprised but remained silent, allowing her to continue. "I have decided to update my estate plans. The people who stand beside me with love will always matter more than the people who simply share my last name." I immediately told her that she did not owe me anything and that I had never cared for her expecting a reward. She laughed softly through tears. "That is exactly why you deserve to hear those words. This is not about money. It is about gratitude." After we ended the call, I sat quietly beside my apartment window as the evening sun faded beyond the rooftops. For the first time since leaving Maple Street, I no longer felt like someone who had been cast aside. I felt like someone who had survived an illusion. Ethan had believed my worth ended the moment he no longer needed my sacrifice, but life was already beginning to prove something far greater. The people who truly recognized love could never mistake it for convenience, and that truth was quietly changing every heart his decision had touched. Several weeks passed, and little by little my new life began to find its own rhythm. Every morning I drove to work with a cup of coffee beside me, listening to the morning radio instead of rehearsing medication schedules in my mind. My desk at the office quickly filled with family photographs from years before my marriage, small plants, and handwritten notes from coworkers who welcomed me back with genuine kindness. I had forgotten what it felt like to be appreciated simply for being myself instead of constantly proving my worth through sacrifice. One Friday afternoon, as I was finishing a report, my phone vibrated. The name on the screen surprised me. "Ethan." I stared at it for several seconds before answering. His voice sounded different from the confident tone I had known for years. It was quieter, uncertain, almost unfamiliar. "Rachel, could we meet for a few minutes?" he asked. I hesitated before agreeing to meet at a small public park near the office the following day. When Saturday arrived, I found him sitting alone on a bench beneath a large oak tree. He looked older than I remembered, not because of time, but because regret has a way of changing a person's face. After I sat down, neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." I listened without interrupting. He admitted that after I left, the house no longer felt like home. His mother barely spoke to him except when necessary. Grace refused to pretend nothing had happened. Even Olivia had questioned why he had treated someone who had given so much with so little compassion. I kept telling myself I had made the practical decision, he said quietly. Then I realized practical decisions do not leave everyone ashamed to look at you. He lowered his eyes before continuing. I did not understand everything you carried until you were gone. I appreciated the honesty in his words, but I also noticed something important. He was finally seeing my value only after losing the benefits of my presence. That realization brought me unexpected clarity. Ethan, I replied gently, I accept your apology because carrying anger only hurts the person holding it. But forgiveness and returning are not the same thing. He nodded slowly, as though he had expected that answer long before asking to meet. I know, he whispered. I just wanted you to hear me say that I was wrong. We sat quietly for another minute, watching children play across the park while families laughed together in the afternoon sunshine. There was no bitterness inside me anymore. The woman who had packed a suitcase with trembling hands no longer existed. She had been replaced by someone who finally understood that love should never require abandoning herself to earn a place in another person's life. As I stood to leave, Ethan quietly thanked me for taking care of his mother when he could not. I smiled kindly before walking away without looking back. Some journeys do not end with revenge or dramatic victories. Sometimes the greatest victory is discovering that your future no longer depends on the person who once underestimated your worth. Almost 1 year later, spring returned to the city with the same gentle warmth that had welcomed me into my new beginning. The trees outside my apartment were covered with fresh green leaves, and the small balcony that had once overlooked an unfamiliar parking lot was now filled with flowers I had planted myself. My life no longer revolved around what I had lost. It revolved around everything I had slowly rebuilt. My career had grown beyond what I imagined possible. I had earned another promotion, made new friends, and rediscovered the quiet confidence that had existed long before I believed love required constant sacrifice. One Saturday morning, I drove to a community garden where volunteers were helping older neighbors prepare their planting beds for the season. As I carried bags of soil across the walkway, I heard a familiar voice call my name. I turned and saw Margaret smiling at me from a nearby bench. She looked healthier than I had seen her in years. We embraced warmly, and for a moment it felt as though no time had passed at all. She proudly told me that she had joined a local reading group, started volunteering twice a week, and even learned how to use video calls to keep in touch with distant relatives. Before we parted, she reached into her purse and handed me a handwritten letter. "Read this when you get home," she said. That evening I unfolded the carefully written pages. She thanked me for every meal, every doctor visit, every encouraging conversation, and every quiet act of kindness that had helped carry her through the hardest season of her life. She wrote that family is not defined only by marriage or blood, but by the people who remain compassionate when no one is watching. At the very end she included a single sentence that brought tears to my eyes. "You walked into my life as my daughter-in-law, but you will always remain my daughter in my heart." I carefully folded the letter and placed it inside the same notebook where I had once written medication schedules and appointment reminders. This time it held something far more valuable than a list of responsibilities. It held proof that genuine love always leaves a lasting mark. As the sun set beyond my apartment window, I found myself thinking back to the day I had packed one small suitcase believing my entire world had ended. I smiled at the memory, not because it no longer hurt, but because I finally understood what that painful day had truly given me. Losing a place where I was merely useful had opened the door to a life where I was genuinely valued. Some people mistake devotion for obligation until it disappears. Others recognize its worth before it is too late. I could not control which lesson Ethan chose to learn, but I could choose the life I built after walking away. And if there is one truth my journey taught me, it is this. The people who see your kindness as something to use will eventually lose it, but the people who see your kindness as a gift will carry your place in their hearts forever.